Imagine a world where every smile, every birthday, and every sunset was filtered through a single company's chemical lens. For over a century, the yellow box was the unofficial passport to the American past, a $28 billion empire that held a near monopoly on how we remembered our own lives. But on a cold morning in January 2012, the Kodak Moment officially died, not because the world stopped taking pictures, but because the men in the mahogany boardrooms of Rochester were too blinded by their own brilliance to see the future. They didn't just miss the digital revolution, they invented it, patented it, and then buried it alive in a desperate attempt to save a profit margin that was already evaporating into the digital ether. This is not just a story of a business that failed. It is a clinical investigation into how arrogance can become a terminal illness for a global titan. The DNA of this tragedy begins in 1888 with George Eastman, a high school dropout who transformed the complex, explosive chemistry of photography into a simple household utility. Before Eastman, photography was a dark art for the elite, requiring heavy glass plates and dangerous chemicals. Kodak's genius was the razor and blade model. Sell the camera cheap, but own the chemical process forever. You press the button, we do the rest, was the slogan that built a monopoly. By the mid-20th century, Kodak owned 90% of the film market and 85% of the camera market in the United States. They weren't just a company, they were the custodians of the American memory, a status that bred a level of corporate hubris that would eventually prove fatal. To understand the scale of the fall, one must understand the technical mastery of silver halide. For Kodak, film wasn't just a product, it was a miracle of precision engineering. Each roll of Kodachrome contained microscopic layers of light-sensitive crystals, a chemical ballet so complex that competitors spent decades trying to replicate it and failed. This technical superiority created a god complex within the walls of Kodak Park in Rochester. The engineers believed that chemistry was the only true way to capture light. They saw themselves as the high priests of a physical, tangible world, viewing any electronic alternative as a toy for the unrefined. This obsession with the physical role of film was the anchor that would eventually drag the entire empire to the bottom of the ocean. The smoking gun of Kodak's suicide was discovered in 1975, deep within their own research labs. A young engineer named Stephen Sasson presented his superiors with a toaster-sized contraption that could capture a black-and-white image on a cassette tape. It was the world's first digital camera. A 0.01 megapixel revolution that required no film, no paper, and no chemicals. But instead of being hailed as a visionary, Sasson was met with a chilling question from the executive suite. "That's cute, but don't tell anyone about it." The leadership didn't see a new market, they saw a threat to their chemical gold mine. They chose to hide the future, to protect the present, a decision that would eventually cost them $28 billion and 145,000 jobs. The corporate culture in Rochester during the 1980s was one of clinical isolation. Kodak was a company town where the school, the hospital, and the parks all bore the Eastman name. This insularity created a feedback loop of denial. While Sony and Canon were beginning to experiment with electronic sensors, Kodak's leadership convinced themselves that digital was a fad that lacked the soul of film. They relied on marketing data that suggested people would always want a physical print to hold. What they failed to realize was that the consumer didn't care about the chemistry, they cared about the moment. By prioritizing the medium over the memory, Kodak began to lose the very thing that made them iconic. Financially, Kodak was a victim of its own success. The profit margins on film were staggering, often exceeding 70%. In contrast, digital technology was a low-margin commodity business. For the executives, transitioning to digital felt like trading a dollar for a dime. They were trapped in the innovator's dilemma, where their current success prevented them from pursuing the very technology that would replace them. They continued to pour billions into improving film quality, reaching near perfection, just as the world was deciding that good enough digital images were better than perfect chemical ones. It was a technical triumph and a strategic catastrophe. By the early 1990s, the cracks were becoming visible to everyone except the board of directors. Fujifilm, a nimble Japanese competitor, began to aggressively undercut Kodak on price while matching their quality. Kodak's response was not to innovate, but to litigate and lobby. They spent millions on trade disputes and marketing campaigns centered on American heritage. But heritage doesn't stop technology. The rise of the personal computer and the early internet meant that images were becoming data, not objects. Kodak's $5 billion investment in Advantix, a hybrid film system, was a desperate attempt to bridge a gap that didn't need to be bridged. It was the sound of a giant trying to stop the tide with a bucket. The human cost of this stagnation began to manifest in Rochester. Once the image capital of the world, the city started to resemble a ghost of its former self. Massive chemical plants that once hummed with 24-hour activity began to go silent. The company that had provided lifelong security for generations of American families was now slashing thousands of jobs every quarter. The Kodak way, a promise of a gold watch retirement, was being replaced by the cold reality of severance packages and shuttered storefronts. The tragedy wasn't just in the loss of a stock price, but in the evaporation of the American industrial dream that George Eastman had helped build. In a final, ironic twist of fate, Kodak actually launched some of the most successful early digital cameras in the late 90s. For a brief moment, they were the #1 digital camera seller in the US, but they were losing money on every unit sold. Because they hadn't controlled the sensor technology or the software early enough, they were just assembling parts from competitors. They had the brand, but they no longer owned the technology. Every digital camera they sold was a nail in the coffin of their film business. They were cannibalizing themselves, but doing it too late to survive the hunger of the market. The early 2000s were a frantic scramble for relevance. Kodak attempted to reinvent itself as an inkjet printer company. trying to replicate the razor and blade model with ink cartridges. But the world was moving past printing altogether. Social media was being born, and photos were meant to be shared on screens, not stuck on refrigerator doors. The acquisition of sites like OPhoto was a brilliant move on paper, but Kodak used it to try and sell more prints rather than building a social network. They had the pieces of the puzzle that would become Instagram and Facebook, but they tried to force them back into the yellow box. The end came not with a bang, but with a series of desperate asset sales. To stay afloat, Kodak began selling off its most valuable patents, technologies that powered the very smartphones that were now killing them. They sold the rights to the digital imaging technology they had invented decades earlier to a consortium of tech giants, including Apple and Google. It was the ultimate corporate indignity, selling the family silver to pay the electricity bill. By the time they filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in 2012, the company was a shell of its former self, its workforce reduced from 145,000 to less than 8,000. The technical autopsy of Kodak reveals a startling truth about modern business. Technical superiority is no shield against a flawed business model. Kodak's engineers were some of the best in the world, and their film was a marvel of the 20th century. But the leadership's inability to detach their identity from a specific chemical process meant that when the world changed, Kodak couldn't. They were a chemistry company in a software world. This fundamental misalignment meant that every innovation they produced was filtered through a lens that was increasingly out of focus. One of the most chilling aspects of the Kodak story is the Steven Sasson effect. When Sasson's digital prototype was rejected, it sent a message through the entire organization: don't bring us anything that disrupts the film business. This effectively lobotomized the company's innovative capacity. The brightest minds left for Silicon Valley, taking with them the future of the company. Kodak became a place where the past went to be polished, while the future was being built in garages 3,000 miles away. It was a brain drain of epic proportions, fueled by a board of directors that valued quarterly dividends over long-term survival. The bankruptcy of 2012 wiped out the savings of thousands of retirees who had invested their entire lives into Big Yellow. For many in Rochester, Kodak wasn't just a stock, it was a promise of stability that had been broken. The emotional impact was profound. People who had spent 40 years in the chemical labs now watched as the buildings were literally imploded to make way for smaller, less ambitious businesses. The sight of Kodak Tower, once a beacon of American industrial might, standing over a landscape of ruins, is a powerful image of the cost of corporate hubris. Kodak's fall also highlights the brutal reality of market cannibalization. To survive, Kodak had to be willing to kill its own most profitable product. This is a psychological hurdle that many legacy brands fail to clear. They viewed digital as the enemy rather than the successor. By the time they realized the enemy had already won, they no longer had the resources to fight back. They were a general fighting the last war with cavalry, while the other side had tanks. Today, Kodak exists as a much smaller entity, focused on commercial printing and a niche resurgence of film for Hollywood directors who still value the aesthetic of grain. There is a certain poetic irony in the fact that the very technology that was discarded is now a luxury item for the elite. But the $28 billion giant that once dominated the American landscape is gone. It has been replaced by a logo that appears on budget batteries and licensed pharmaceutical products, a ghost of a brand that once meant everything. The lesson for the modern investor and the student of history is clear. No empire is too big to fail if it refuses to evolve. Kodak's failure was not of intelligence, but one of imagination. They could see the digital world coming. They built the tools to create it, but they couldn't imagine themselves in it without a roll of film in their hand. They were victims of a narrow definition of their own purpose. They thought they were in the film business when they were actually in the business of storytelling. As we look back at the yellow boxes that still sit in the back of our closets, we are reminded of a time when the world moved slower, and a Kodak moment was something you waited a week to see. That nostalgia is powerful, but it is also a warning. The same forces that erased Kodak are currently working on the giants of today. The digital world that Kodak feared is now being disrupted by artificial intelligence and decentralized platforms. The question is, which of today's titans is currently ignoring a toaster-sized prototype in their own lab? The legacy of George Eastman still lingers in the philanthropy he left behind, but the industrial engine he created has stalled. Rochester has had to reinvent itself without its primary benefactor, a painful process that has taken decades. The empty chemical tanks and the silent laboratories serve as a monument to the fact that in the world of high-stakes business, the only thing more dangerous than being wrong is being right too early and then doing nothing about it. In the final analysis, Kodak didn't lose its way. It stood its ground while the ground moved beneath it. The yellow globe still glows on a few buildings, but the world it illuminated has changed forever. The Kodak story is the ultimate American tragedy, a company that gave the world the power to remember but forgot how to imagine its own future. It remains a $600 billion reminder, when adjusted for the markets they lost, that no matter how high you build your tower, if the foundation is made of ego and debt, gravity always wins.